Inez Stepman.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Jeremy Carl.
I'm Batya Ungar-Sargon.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, obviously, there really is only one thing in the news this week, and that is the horrific attack on Israel by Hamas and the terrible stories that are coming out there, and then the inevitable way in which this attack is going to change not only the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Middle East, but America, the West, and the world. So we've tried to split this up into 4 segments, but they're all going to be on the same thing or different aspects of it. First, we're going to go to Ben, and he's going to lay out the basics and the nature of the conflict as it stands now. I'm going to talk about the discussion about what the Israeli response is likely to be, what it ought to be. Then we're going to go to Jeremy, and he's going to talk about implications for the United States, what we in the United States should be doing about this or should not be doing about this. We're going to have a discussion there. And then finally, we're going to take it to Batya, and we're going to talk about the context, the call for quote unquote context, the response from certain media outlets or American universities or the left more broadly, and talk about what that means for domestic politics, but also what that means for the way that fault lines are drawn in the political world going forward. So with that, let me turn it back over to Ben to kick us off.
So as the world knows at this point, Iran-backed Hamas engaged in a Nazi-esque genocidal jihadist effort over the past weekend and extending into this week, killing 1,300 plus people, including among them Americans, 27 Americans, I believe is the number at this point, taking hostage 100 to 150 plus individuals, including among them, I believe 14 Americans at this point. The nature of the savagery is incomparable in modern history. Unlike the Nazis, Hamas sought to circulate the images, the indescribable images, on social media. And by the way, my personal view, and something we could probably talk about, is whether those images should be shown and ought to be shown. From my perspective, I think the world ought to see the savagery and the barbarism that exists. Beyond the horrific stories of massacring villages, the beheadings of babies, the taking hostage of, among others, a Holocaust survivor among the cruelest of the stories, we saw essentially in one day an intifada that killed the equivalent in U.S. population terms of tens of thousands of people. So there's any number of things that can and will be said about what happened. Before I kind of go into the geopolitical dimensions of this and some of the backdrop to it, it's worth noting, first of all, that I think I speak for all of us here, that our prayers are with all those involved with this program and this entire NatCon initiative involved, including the Hazoni family and one of our producers, Eliasaf, and everyone else directly and indirectly involved in sort of the NatCon family more broadly. We can talk about a lot of different dimensions of this. Briefly, we could talk about the history of Gaza itself. Gaza was a piece of land that was taken by Israel in a defensive effort in 1967 after Israel was attacked from multiple sides. Israel had settled in a number of communities there, Israeli citizens over time, but decided to unilaterally pull out in 2005. Hamas took over in the Gaza Strip in 2006. Hamas, by its very covenant or charter, has been dedicated to Israel's destruction from the very beginning, and its genocidal Jew hatred is intrinsic to it and is engaged in savagery before. This was on another level and shocked the psyche of, I think, Israelis, of those in the West more broadly, and probably even surprised jihadist forces themselves, the level of success from their vantage point. Now, in the immediate term, there are likely to be hostage-related crises with Hamas using Israeli prisoners and Americans as human shields, including taking them down into their terror tunnels, which creates a very difficult decision. Are you going to trade for hostages, which Israel has done in the past at massive cost, including over 1,000 Arab Palestinian prisoners, potential, and in some cases actual jihadists for Gilad Shalit in the past. The scope and scale of the number of hostages on this time is in a completely different level. And then otherwise, to the extent you have incursions and you try to exfiltrate the hostages, of course, there are going to be booby traps and all sorts of ways in which Israel is going to suffer substantial casualties, and many of the hostages are unlikely to survive. Qatar, to start getting into the geopolitical dimensions, is the home of Hamas's leadership and is trying to serve as a go-between between the jihadists and Israel in connection with any such crisis. You have 1 million people being told to leave Gaza, but Egypt is not opening the crossing out. Something very telling in all of this: none of the Arab countries in the region seem to be willing to take in the Gazans, which I think speaks volumes about the situation at hand. And you don't see the world screaming out, crying out, why aren't you taking in refugees for resettlement? Worth noting, more broadly than the kind of immediate term, this obviously has the potential to turn into a multi-front, not just massive regional war, but potentially a global war, because Iran's proxies, not just Hamas, are operating obviously via Hezbollah in Lebanon, in Syria, including a number of other quote-unquote Iranian-backed militias, proxies. That extends, of course, also to Iraq, Yemen, and beyond, and then to Tehran itself. So there's a question of, is Israel solely going to focus on eviscerating Hamas, as seems to be the case, or is it potentially going to have to strike in some of these other fronts to deter a much greater battle? Will those fronts open up and force Israel's hand? Of course, Iran itself is a proxy to some extent as a strategic partner of China and Russia. Russia has usually, kind of like the Qataris, played both sides in this region. They have, on the one hand, been an ally of Iran, but on the other hand, have allowed Israel to engage in strategic bombing where necessary, for example, in Syria. So this becomes a very complex situation very quickly, one that could easily spiral out of control. The point I'll make, and obviously we're going to delve into these issues in specific segments, but the points I'll make up top are, one, in my view, I believe that for Israel to defend its national interest, and that national interest will redound to the benefit of the rest of the Western world, including to the U.S., to the extent it's vigorously pursued, I believe that Israel has to strike in a dramatic, quick fashion and decisive fashion that sends a signal that it will not be deterred in defending its national interest, and that it will deter full-scale assaults from almost all sides, essentially, in this. And absent that decisive and crippling blow, if this is a long, drawn-out and grisly ground war solely focused on Gaza and the elimination of Hamas originally, kind of counterintuitively, that may lead to much greater bloodshed down the road. So we'll talk about kind of Israel's plans. We'll talk about what we in the U.S. ought to be doing, how our national interests ought to be served. And it's worth noting, I think also at the top, how little focus has really been placed on the fact Americans were killed, and Iran has been killing and taking hostage Americans since the bloody revolution took place, starting with obviously the hostage crisis in 1979, extending to the blowing up the U.S. embassy in Beirut, the Beirut Lebanon barrack bombings as well, the Khobar Tower bombings, hundreds of American troops killed by Iranian-made IEDs over the last 20 years and beyond, including potential strikes on our own soil. So there's a long war that Iran has been engaged in, and its proxies have been engaged in against the West. This is a manifestation of it in Israel. Israel's the little Satan, we're the great Satan, and a catastrophic blow has been struck. But this was the opening salvo in what could potentially become a much greater war, again, in my view, to the extent Israel does not respond resolutely and decisively and in dramatic fashion.
Yeah, thank you for the overview, Ben. I mean, I agree with you on some points, and I think I maybe would differ from you on some points. But as far as what the Israelis do in response, I think that ultimately that's their strategic calculation as an independent nation. And I think from our interest perspective, which I'll get into more later, I think the key thing is that they not be seen as a proximity. We're not kind of seen as the hidden hand behind whatever Israel does. Israel has to do what it's going to do, and we have to do what's in our interests. Those interests have some overlap, but they're not the same. I'm certainly in agreement with you about the barbarity of the attacks, and I think beyond that, there's just not much to be said. The fact that those barbarity of attacks was excused in the way that it was by many folks, even in the West, is concerning, but to say the least, and sort of speaks to some broader issues that I'll get into during my segment.
I've been thinking a lot about how wrong Hamas was in what its expectations of how this was going to unfold. It seems to me that they fundamentally misunderstood what the world's reaction was going to be to this in a way that I think I may have also I did not expect the response that I'm seeing, which is just complete and utter widespread condemnation, not just for the brutality, but for anybody who cannot unequivocally condemn it. The partisan divide over Israel seems to me to be gone. President Biden has been utterly stalwart in Israel's defense, and the extremist voices in his party, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, and Rashida Tlaib, have been totally sidelined. The disgust for them is so all-encompassing. Of course, you have these very ugly apologias for Hamas all over Twitter, but they are so not representative, and so much of the left has come out in support of Israel in a way that truly shocked me, and it seems to me also may have shocked Hamas. And so I'm asking myself a lot, like, what was the failure here? This clearly was a huge miscalculation. I mean, just beyond the atrocities, which obviously have moral implications. But I think even in terms of thinking about the Palestinian cause, I mean, this was just a huge tactical error. So of course, it signals the larger geopolitical context that Ben, you laid out so beautifully. This question of this was not obviously just Hamas versus Israel. This was Iran versus the West, Iran versus the U.S. Although I also think that keeping the conflict as limited as possible, and I guess I disagree with you a bit here, Ben, is the move. Because as somebody who's still a lefty, I'm anti-war, but also because I think that Iran could not have done this without Hamas, and they need their proxies, right? They need their foot soldiers to carry out these attacks. And so to me, the move is to support Israel and its to make it as successful as possible in eradicating its neighbor and enemy, and rescuing what innocent Palestinian civilians there are from the reign of Hamas, the reign of terror that Hamas has inflicted on its own people as well. And then perhaps having some kind of Belfast moment here moving forward for the region.
Well, let me just jump in and, first, I just want to echo, totally agree on Jeremy's part of things. Like, I fully believe that this is about Israel defending itself. And the more that the U.S. is engaged in certain specific ways, I think it will actually be about restraining Israel and de facto serving the interests of the very groups that this administration and the Obama-Biden administration before it tried to make ascendant and the strong course in the region. I was also remiss in noting that I do think there is merit to the conventional wisdom of this was in part about scuttling Iran, Israel, Saudi normalization, however we want to define that, and probably the broader kind of reordering of the region of Sunni Arab powers and Israel. But I do think it goes beyond that as well. And let me just note, I am not advocating, and it's not my place to advocate, I'm not advocating for Israel to open a multi-front war or to strike anywhere beyond Gaza at this point. I'm just saying that as a practical matter, I think that move may ultimately prove to save more lives than taking this kind of one adversary at a time. But as a practical matter, that may not be even possible, let alone necessarily desirable. With that, Inez is back with us. I'll turn it over to Inez.
Yeah, sorry about the technical difficulties, folks. So in terms of framing this conflict, before we get to the implications, and I know we've all been bleeding into the implications because and the response because it's unavoidable. To be honest, my first thought beyond the obvious humanitarian response, the obvious human response to these kinds of atrocities against children, against babies, against women, this looks a lot. My response was this is actually much what it looked like for settlers on the frontier in America to be raided by Comanche. And it's interesting to me that when I make that comparison, the first thing that people start arguing about is who came here first, right? As though that's the main point of the comparison, when in fact, I'm making a comparison about two different levels of civilization and two different ways of organizing human beings into societies that are incompatible. Incompatible in the short term, probably incompatible in the long term, and it really becomes difficult to think about what constitutes a response or even a like theoretical solution going forward when you have that level of mismatch between the very sort of core organizational commitments of human societies. And that may sound very hopeless in a certain sense. I mean, I think it is sort of the way of the world. And by the way, I think there are some key differences among them that Islam and the particular ethnic conflict in the Middle East is totalitizing and universalizing and focus in a way that, tribal life was not on, for example, among American Indians. The tribes fought each other. There wasn't this relentless, actually, hatred for the new American tribe that had shown up on the shores. This was very much a way of life that Americans it was not compatible with American civilization. So in this case, it's much more universal and totalitizing and relentless in a certain sense because it is focused particularly on killing the Jews. In the Middle East. So that's kind of my 10,000 foot level in terms of setting this up. But I want to transition then to what can or should be done about it. And first we'll talk about what Israel can or should do about it. And then we'll move on to, I actually want to include in Jeremy's segment, not only American response, but the West, because I think there's as we see this day of rage, recording this on Friday, right? It's a day of jihad, right? We'll see what the day brings us, but it's undoubtedly, this is something that's going to affect the domestic tranquility of most countries in the West. So in terms of Israel's response, we always hear after, I mean, it really feels like a rewind to the 2000s. We are now once again engaged in a debate about how much these atrocious acts and the acts of Hamas or Hezbollah represent the ambitions of the Palestinian people. And we're going to be engaged very shortly, if we have not already been in the last 48 hours, in a discussion about what constitutes an appropriate or constitutional or proportional, that's the favorite word, right? Proportional response on the part of the state of Israel. So first of all, a proportional response, like I said about and I think that's why it was a good transition about the two different levels of civilization. If we were to do the biblical eye for an eye response here, map out what that would look like, that's something the state of Israel would never want to engage in, which is, going in and killing a corresponding number of civilians and kidnapping a corresponding number of women and raping a corresponding number of women in response. So again, I think proportionality here is the exact wrong problem in terms of what is, I think, is likely to happen. And maybe some of you will have different ideas about that. I think it's likely that we'll see a very heavy bombing campaign, which we already have seen in Gaza. I think already 12% of the buildings have been leveled. Obviously, Israel has sent in repeated notifications to evacuate. It seems like they're pushing people to evacuate towards the Egyptian border. I think trying to put pressure on Egypt to open that border, as Ben pointed out. There's a very telling fact about this. People call Gaza an open air prison, quote unquote, but they neglect to say that the other half of that quote unquote prison is a border with Egypt that Egypt does not open. And so when Israelis put up for security fence or whatever else to separate themselves from Gaza, which, as Ben also said, they have not controlled since the mid-2000s, and their withdrawal, Egypt is doing the same thing and has been doing the same thing and continues to stand by closing that border and not allowing people, but they're asking people to evacuate to the south. I wonder if that's intended to put pressure on Egypt. And then I think they are going to the only thing that any state faced with this kind of attack would do. They have to destroy the capability of Hamas to launch these kinds of attacks. And that means destroying the leadership, killing the leadership. It means destroying whatever munitions and research and development and military facilities they have. And unfortunately, because Hamas is Hamas, this means doing heavy fighting in civilian areas, because Hamas intentionally places its military assets among civilians and uses civilians as a shield, and counts on, in fact, the reaction not only in the broader world watching this, but within Israel itself, sees as weakness the fact that Israel does not want to indiscriminately kill civilians in order to get to Hamas. It is actively telling those civilians to stay in place, not to follow Israeli evacuation orders, not to leave, saying either it's propaganda or simply directly saying, we need as many of you to die as possible in order to, it's a tactic of war for us. So in terms of what is likely to happen and what should happen, I think Israel has to decapitate the ability of Hamas to operate and bring to justice the people who have done this. I think that will likely, unfortunately, involve enormous loss of civilian life. And I think the moral responsibility for that loss of civilian life falls squarely on Hamas, and not only for being the aggressors in this conflict, but also for the specific tactics that they use, making it unable to engage with them as nation state to nation state, right? In the way that the West conducts war, and that's that return. I would turn again to sort of my Comanche analogy. It's simply, you cannot, as a nation state, like, this is not the same thing as a normal war with a nation state, which of course every nation has committed atrocities during war. That's part of what war is. And the fact that we in the West imagine that war can be conducted without some of those atrocities is a narcissism of our own incredibly blessed position. But that is part of war, and advanced nation states, as we well know, conduct appalling atrocities on each other, but there's still this sort of symmetrical. There's a goal. There's one nation trying to impose its will on another, and there's a fight, and there's an endpoint in mind in terms of one will submit when it's clear that they are not going to win and impose their will on the other. That's not really the shape of this conflict. It hasn't been the shape of this conflict. And before I turn it over to the rest of the panel to talk about what Israel's response should have been or should be going forward, I would finally say that a note on social media and on the horrific videos that are circulating, in some way, I think this is good to see and to look directly at what is going on, because for so many people in the world, and all of us lived through the sort of debates around this in the early 2000s, what was happening was mediated through the BBC or through CNN or through sort of the bias of journalists covering these conflicts, and now directly because of social media, we can see, and because these people are bragging about the war crimes that they're conducting, they're bragging about executing children, they're bragging about terrorizing families and taking young women as hostages back to Gaza. So I think there is an opportunity, at least, for a certain amount of moral clarity among people who perhaps either, through being misled by media or by their own ideological biases, like did not have eyes to see what is actually happening and the shape of this conflict. So with that, we still have a few minutes in the segment. And I'm curious what you guys think an appropriate, I don't want to say proportionate, actually, an appropriate response from the state of Israel to this attack would be.
Well, Inez, I mean, I actually think your Comanche analogy is quite interesting for both reasons. One, the one that you mentioned about civilizations, which is maybe not as intuitive to some people, but I do actually think the land piece of this is important. And this is the way that I maybe differ a little bit with Ben and even some of the other people who commentate on this, which is without in any way minimizing or not being aware of the kind of genocidal rhetoric that takes place in Palestinian schools underneath the RWA in this case, or anything like this. Ultimately, this is a conflict over land, and two groups that have claim to land, that they feel that they have historical claim to land, they have religious claim to land. And I am not fond of the Nazi analogies on this, even though these were certainly Nazi-level atrocities against civilians. And I don't mean to minimize those in any way. And even as Ben pointed out, they were publicized, which makes them worse in some ways. But I do think that this is a territorial struggle in which two groups with very different ideas of what the rules of civilized behavior are engaged in a really brutal struggle. I kind of see it as a more normal war in that way, as much as the atrocities were unquestionably atrocities. And then I think the other way I'd push back a little bit is Hamas being clearly responsible, and you can kind of read all the relevant international law and et cetera, for locating its civilian assets where they are. I think if Israel thinks either practically or even legally that they could simply just completely level everything and kill endless numbers of children, with 50% of those folks being children, just because Hamas is using those assets in that way and locating military assets, I think they're going to find, both from a moral perspective and more importantly from a Hasbara, a public diplomacy type perspective, that it's not going to work out for them in the way that they can, which doesn't mean that they should be proportional necessarily. I would agree with you on that if I were an Israeli strategist. But I do think that even with all of the crimes of Hamas being noted, the notion that Israel is either practically or theoretically going to be given carte blanche to do what it wants in Gaza would be naive in my view.
I kind of want to push back a little bit on this idea of the kind of civilizational or societal conflict. I mean, even within Palestinian culture, you have radically different versions of that based on whether you're a Palestinian citizen of Israel living, within Israel proper, whether you're a Palestinian living in East Jerusalem, whether you're a Palestinian living in Ramallah or a Palestinian living in Gaza. I mean, the circumstances of their existence are so different. To think of it as a kind of civilizational conflict, I think really erases that. And also the fact that so many Gazans are the victims of Hamas, and we don't, it's very hard to gauge what public opinion is based on the kind of the bad faith of the people gathering it oftentimes. But, obviously within that society, there's 2 million people, and there's going to be a lot of different, there's going to be people who, support what Hamas did, and there's a lot of people who really, really don't, and a lot of people whose ability to make that moral judgment is probably confused right now based on the fact that they're homeless or themselves possibly grieving children. So I think that's really important to keep in mind. And the other thing that I want to say, and I really do not mean this at all in a victim blaming way, but Hamas has been propped up by Netanyahu throughout his reign. He has weakened Abbas and weakened Fatah because he believed, like many of us believed, I think, that Hamas was in a weakened state, and that bringing some kind of quiet to Israel meant, in a way, negotiating the powers in that way. The money coming into Hamas through Qatar was facilitated by the Netanyahu government for many years. And God forbid, I think it's despicable to blame this on Netanyahu, but at the same time to ignore the fact that within Israel itself, there was a certain view of Hamas that was wrong, and that complicates the idea of their interests being totally at odds with Israel's, at least from the point of view of the Netanyahu government, during, for many years over the last 2 decades. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, and it's important to point that out without, God forbid, suggesting that there's any kind of moral equivalency or anything beyond that.
I've kind of talked a bit already about kind of how I see the Israeli perspective and kind of what is to be done now from the rubble. I would just point out really quickly, well, I'll probably be writing on this. I think that Lee Smith, Tony Badran, and Michael Doran have also said some very interesting things about kind of what comes next. So I would not defer to them, but I would refer folks to some of what they've been writing and saying lately for reference. Also, just as a factual matter, it is worth noting, and this is not in any way to state that there aren't going to be tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people whose lives are going to be upended, who would never want to live under Hamas. But it is worth noting as a factual matter that Hamas was elected into power in Gaza in 2006. There has been polling done, and obviously you have to take every poll with a grain of salt. 2019, there was a survey conducted by the Palestine Center for Public Opinion, which is based in Bethlehem. That polling found that 48% of those in Gaza listed as their top Palestinian national priority during the coming 5 years the, quote, regaining of all historical Palestine for the Palestinians from the river to the sea. So I think it's worth noting that it's not as if Hamas doesn't represent some sizable percentage of this population.
But Ben, can I just say?
I'm saying it's going to be it's going to be a huge tragedy for those whose lives are impacted by people who are not representing them. But it is also to say that they do represent a sizable percentage of that population.
But I'll just say, and I don't need to have the last word here, but I'll just say, like, the way that you phrase that the retaking of historical Palestine, I know people who do not want to see a hair harmed on the head of a single Jew, who would say, yeah, there should be a one-state solution and we should all be equal citizens. Like, that is consistent with the phrasing of that. That doesn't mean they support Hamas. I don't need to be their, like, defenders here. Like, there's plenty of them there that have genocidal views towards Jews. But specifically that question, I think, does not prove that. Although, like, obviously, like, a lot of them support Hamas, right? But yeah.
Yeah, I view from the river to the sea as equivalent to a genocide in Israel. I don't think we'll be able to bridge or divide over how to interpret that, and that's okay. We can differ.
So I have pushback of my own about the civilization thing, but I'll save it for final thoughts. So we can move to the American implications of this, and if Jeremy, you could kick off that discussion.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Inez. So I'd say, first of all, I mean, my headline on it would be, they're not the same as Israeli interests. I've been dismayed that a number of our politicians, as they have often done, have sort of casually equated that. I think it's been a lot of the same sloppy diplomacy and this very moralizing diplomacy that is not serious to me in this region and elsewhere. I don't think this is unique to this conflict, although I think it gets particularly heated in this conflict. I've said I don't think that we should be too involved frontally, at least. I think there are some things that we should be doing behind the scenes, and I'll talk about those. I'd say our first priority right now is evacuating our citizens. I'm kind of was annoyed that Biden was very late to the game. We've now seen DeSantis kind of step forward in some useful ways. We had a congressman down in Florida kind of personally get involved with rescue, but I think that our first responsibility is to our citizens. Also point out a problematic thing in this, and this is, I don't know how popular this view will be here, but as an American nationalist, I'm very against dual citizenship. And one of the problems that I think we have here, and it's particularly relevant to the Israeli conflict, is we have all these people who are citizens, and ultimately, from a practical perspective, we have to treat them as citizens. But it's not clear to me how many of these people are living in the U.S. and have their primary, and frankly, in my view, as any citizen should, their only loyalty to the U.S. versus people who are, as again, we have in many areas of the world, citizens on paper, but who are really, essentially living in another country and kind of involved in the life of the other country. So I'll just point that out as a side thing. I don't think it ultimately, in the short term, affects, our calculus as far as what we do with our own citizens or hostages, but I think it's a problematic nature of dual citizenship that I'm not, is one of the reasons why I'm not in favor of it. I think we have an interest in simmering down the conflict, not having a wider war, whatever that's going to look like. That is, I think, very, very clearly the core American interest here, that trumps everything else. We want, for our own selfish reasons, Israel, I think, to do whatever it needs to do to decisively deter a future attack like this. That certainly I do think at the minimum probably means completely decapitating Hamas's leadership and its proxies elsewhere. I don't think that from a I'm not saying that because that's a Israeli interest. I think that ultimately that's what will be necessary for the U.S. interest to be served in calming this down, which is that Hamas ultimately has to pay a severe price. But on the other hand, where I think I flip is the Israelis might have even interest in annexing Gaza or doing, a number of other things that I've seen floated out in the media. I don't know that that is in our interests. And certainly I wouldn't want us to see us involved in anything like that. I think you do need rulership. I think one thing that we could be doing very productively behind the scenes is putting a lot of pressure on Qatar to stop harboring Hamas leaders. Again, this is a U.S. interest, and just, clearly it's, we've learned, if we didn't know it already, that having this type of kind of genocidal and barbarous leadership over any part of the Palestinian people is not in the interests of peace in the region. On the other hand, I don't think you can prop up a puppet government, so I don't know what that looks like, but certainly not allowing Hamas leadership to operate with impunity from Qatar would be an interest of the United States. And then I'd say, we've seen this spiral out onto U.S. campuses, et cetera, close the border. This is, to me, these are completely related conflicts. And I, keep watching these proxy wars between people who have, really primary interests in other countries in the United States. And, I've commented on this on Twitter, Inez. I know you had commented on one of my comments on this as well. I kind of go back to Theodore Roosevelt and the dangers of having a bunch of squabbling nationalities without sole interest in the U.S. In our country. So we've let a lot of these people, and then even more particularly, we've let in a lot of people who, above and beyond, they're actually having an interest in something, which another country, a primary interest, which is bad enough, are really excusing barbarism and genocidal behavior. And so I think that is itself, a problem and a real reason why we need to focus on our own border and who we're letting into the country, who we're making citizens. I've seen folks like Jack Posobiec say, hey, we used to deport people. And that's something that we need to be looking at, for people, not because they have political opinion, but if they, if they're not citizens and they, are extreme enough in the sorts of things they're advocating, there's no reason to have them here. So I think just looking at that broader conflict and kind of understanding those needs is what I see as important. But ultimately, I think, our primary interests here are taking care of our own citizens, making sure that we get them to a place that's safe, making sure that we make it clear to Hamas or whoever's holding them that if they mess with American citizens, there are going to be real consequences for that. And those consequences are going to be severe. And then beyond that, to make sure that this doesn't turn into a wider war, because we've got a lot of other challenges that we're dealing with geopolitically. I continue to think China is, our most serious geopolitical adversary. And we have a lot of things right now, both here and in Ukraine and elsewhere, that are really pulling us away from, the focus on that, plus the focus on the home front that I think we need.
So I think I've mentioned this construct before when we talked about Ukraine, for example, on this show, where I've been in the minority, I know, in terms of thinking that it is in our interest to support Ukraine in this war. I think we are in a real danger of always fighting the last war, right? And while it's important to take lessons from each of America's mistakes, I think it's my role here is to point out, I think that there's a danger of overcorrection as well, right? We went into the Gulf War with the Gulf War I with guns a-blazing, and flattened, right? Flattened our enemies in that war because we were terrified of the drawn out conflict in Vietnam, and still carried the wounds from that. We went into Iraq the second time thinking it would be like the first time, without a clear end game and with the completely utopian goal of essentially trying to drag people 300 or 400 years ahead in civilizational advancement to try to turn them into a liberal democracy, which was always fanciful. And Americans rightly have a bad taste in their mouths from investing, most importantly, the lives of American servicemen and women for 20 years in the Middle East, and having nothing to show for it but the horrendous way in which we, showed the world our ass, frankly, in withdrawing from Kabul, right? And so all of that is a legitimate, I think, recentering of American foreign policy on hard-headed interests. But that does not mean that we do not have interests beyond our borders. And I think Ben Domenech actually said it quite well in a debate recently with Dan Smith, where he said the U.S., in my view, does have, and I agree with him here, an interest in trying to keep stability in the world, in kind of what Jeremy was saying about preventing some of this from spiraling into World War III. And we have an interest in maintaining the reality of a stable world with the United States in charge. And us being in charge doesn't mean that we have to interfere in every conflict in the world or try to teach goat herders how to, vote like American citizens. But it does mean that if we're not in charge, somebody else, some other great power will be. And I think we are moving into an era of multipolarity and great power conflict. And that does have to be our priority. But actually, I think we can overcorrect when we don't recognize that actually the U.S. does have an interest, for example, in maintaining peace on the European continent and maintaining post-1945 borders on the European continent. That is an enormously dangerous situation for the United States, because we are, in some sense, the hegemon of the world. We will inevitably be drawn into these conflicts if we do not do it on our terms and in favor of our interests. And similarly here, I think what's required from us is actually relatively small. I think oftentimes people overestimate how important, for example, U.S. aid is in terms of dollars and tanks to Israel, although our armory supplies to them are incredibly important, because apparently they do run out of ammo, and they probably will run out of ammo if we don't supply them in this. But in terms of like the massive commitments that we've had to make, we have not, and I don't think anyone in Israel is really asking the United States to, make a massive, for example, ground, troop commitment or some other massive interventions. What the United States really can offer our allies, and they are some of our best and most consistent allies, at least since the 1970s, where before in the Cold War, they played both sides a little bit. But at least since the 70s, they're one of our most consistent allies. What they do need from the United States, I think, is diplomatic moral clarity, which I have to give to the Biden administration on this. I think their initial statement was quite strong. I was very surprised. And then cover in the UN. Essentially, I don't think Israel is asking us for help. They're asking us not to interfere. And it's funny to me that some people who maybe are more skeptical of interventions abroad, their first instinct in this is to say, no, we don't want to be involved. Well, actually, that's kind of what we're being asked to do, except in very minor ways. It's to not interfere, to allow Israel to conduct this operation in whatever way they see fit, and to be their friend. And without, massive like U.S. ground troop commitments and so on and so forth, right? There is a big danger that, I think the big wild card in all this, and I'm really curious what Ben thinks about this, because he knows so much about the domestic side and the foreign policy establishment within the Biden government. The big danger here is of a wider war is Iran, right? Israel, at great personal cost and mobilization, but probably is not overmatched by Hezbollah and Hamas, although they shouldn't underestimate their enemies, who have clearly been planning this for a long time. But the big question for the U.S., I think, is Iran, and our actions, our foreign policy actions, and our interest towards Iran. I think this administration has really, and before then the Obama administration has really again gone with this utopian idea that all cultures and peoples are sort of similar and acting in their self-interests and rational, and have made incredible mistakes. Just one brief point. I know we're running out of segment on this segment and all others, and I know Ben needs to talk, but I don't want to let this segment about the West and America more broadly slip without emphasizing what Jeremy said. There is, I really wonder if this will be the turning point for some of these European countries to realize that they have effectively imported a totally different civilization into their borders, and that essentially the Arab Street is now in Paris, and I wonder how that will affect the elections. I wonder how it'll affect the shape of politics, especially with the migrant crisis building back up to 2017 levels in Europe. And I would note, in Poland and Hungary, you're not seeing the same kind of demonstrations, and that's because they simply didn't allow these people in as migrants, or at least not in nearly as large numbers. Louise Perry on Twitter had a great summarization of this, talking about one of the videos of one of the, I assume, Palestinian women who was in these demonstrations, showing pictures of the atrocities and dead Israelis and dead children, and then mocking it and saying, wow, you're crying about this, and just positively gleeful about it. And Louise's tweet was dead on, which is just said, the question is not why this woman feels this way, but why she's here. And I think that's really to the point and well put.
So tough for me to address this in a really short period of time. I guess I'll start with quickly what I think the Biden administration will do is I think that the rhetoric put forth is ultimately a front. I think what the Biden administration's interest in doing is, and we see this in the constant hemming and hawing and trying to de-link Iran from what its proxy executed, a very complex and sophisticated incursion, even if done with crude tools. I think that their entire interest in this is restraining Israel so that Israel is solely focused on Hamas, specifically within Gaza. And the Biden administration's interest is in ensuring that Hezbollah does not lose its dominance over Lebanon, and obviously that the Tehran regime is stable, because the thrust policy of the Biden administration, again, has been to make Iran the strong force in the region. The administration wouldn't even refer to Abraham Accords internally. The so-called Israel-Saudi normalization that the Biden administration supposedly was trying to put forth was, I would refer folks to what Lee Smith and Tony Badran have written on this. I think a way to try to box Israel so that when there was an Iran deal 2.0, it would constrain Israel. So I think whatever would be in Iran's national interest, without it appearing as if the Biden administration is doing what Iran would want, I believe that is what will happen. That's a very contrarian perspective. I'm sure it could get a ton of pushback, but that's how I see it. What would an American national interest oriented response look like? I largely agree with Jeremy, big picture. And obviously agree that China is by far the number one threat that we face, remains the number one threat we face. But by getting mired in the Middle East for 2 decades, that redounded directly to communist China's benefit. My kind of 3-point plan where we might disagree in the details is obviously first, secure our people. I have not heard the Biden administration doing anything to put pressure on Iran and its proxies, which it should have great friendly relations with, to put pressure on Hamas to release American hostages, notably. So hostages first, but after that, secure the homeland. And that is first completely closing our borders. And then second of all, dealing with the mass immigration that we've had in the 2+ decades since 9/11, which has created a huge potential population of Islamic supremacists, their sympathizers, and then obviously the Native American population that we see on campuses taking their sides, and the elites in some ways are a much bigger force multiplier there. Those are usually significant problems before we even get to anything else that the U.S. would have to do to protect and preserve its interest. And essentially gives jihadists a potential veto over the West when you have such a massive sympathetic population here that can effectively control our policy and constrain what we might want to do. Beyond that, do no harm. And by that, I mean, stop doing anything that supports Iran, its proxies, or their harborers. That also would require a massive, massive reorientation of policy, which I don't see. But I think at a bare minimum, you should not be doing a single thing to benefit those directly or indirectly responsible for killing Americans or taking them hostage. Last but not least, get out of the way and let Israel defend itself as it sees fit. Jeremy, where he and I might differ is he might think that what Israel perceives to be in its self-interest does not correspond with what's in the U.S. self-interest. We could probably have an interesting debate over that. But what does kind of, from my perspective, U.S. getting out of the way mean? It means not restraining Israel in its offensive missions. It also means working together in an intelligence context, which, kind of exists by treaty in terms of the kind of alliance that we have, non-NATO ally status that exists, intelligence, sales of munitions and weapon systems. And then I agree with Inez on providing diplomatic cover and support, which to my mind, the benefits of that infinitely outweigh the costs. Again, we probably have debates on the specifics of this, but that's kind of my 3-point plan. Secure the homeland, do no harm, and get out of the way.
And with that, I want to take it. I think it's a very good transition. Actually, we've been talking about sort of the implications of the response at home, but I turn it over to Batya for a discussion about rather than all these wider geopolitical consequences and response, which we may disagree about, to talk about these attacks themselves and how they're being framed here at home in America.
I do just briefly want to respond to the last point, because I think that the wrong lesson to draw would be that, as somebody who lives in Brooklyn, which is a city where there are many, many, many Jews, Orthodox Jews like myself, and many, many, many Muslims, and it would never, ever happen that there would be ethnic conflict. I mean, just a very, very peaceable, multi-ethnic borough. And the reason for that is has to do a lot with class, with the kind of economic stability that these two communities have been able to find and forge in this great nation. So just again, coming back to this, I think the wrong lesson to draw would be that there's somehow some kind of like incompatibility between, Muslims, the vast majority in this country, abhor what happened, and the goals that we all think are, the point of a Western nation state, a democracy, a liberal society, and so forth. Maybe you guys don't believe in a liberal society, but probably liberal values like free speech and so forth. Like we need to not, these protests that happen where you had young people getting together and saying really gross things about what happened, like that is a big part of the American experiment, right? Like we believe in free speech. The ACLU used to believe in defending Nazis' right to march. And, it would be a real shame if we gave up on what made us better than them in response to them. To me, as somebody who's been watching this very closely, and the response on the left, like those protests, cheering on the Hamas atrocities, they're not like the peak of some sort of iceberg. They're not the tip of an iceberg. Like they are the entirety of the iceberg. And I'm glad to have seen it and glad to know that it exists. Because first of all, on the grounds of free speech, that's what makes this the greatest country on earth. And we really shouldn't, I think, speak in a way about this, even about people that we hate. And when we hate what they say in a way that suggests that we don't support their right to say it. Because of course, the crucible of free speech is only for people who say atrocious things, right? It's very easy to protect the free speech of people that we agree with. But also, like I said, I think, it's extremely important to distinguish between the extremists on the one hand, and not to act like they are representative of more than they are. I think that's really what you're seeing in the huge backlash against the squad and against these universities. And I think it's a great thing for universities to be held to task for the ways in which they've inculcated this kind of horrific, allowed this to spread. we could probably move on to final thoughts, right? I think I took up my time responding to that one, but I'll just say my final thought really quickly, and then we can all go around, which is I was asked during a radio interview yesterday if what happened in the south of Israel made me, how it made me think in terms of like questions of gun ownership. And the host, I think very innocently said, wouldn't it have been better if all of those Jews were armed and they weren't just sitting there with without any ability to defend themselves? And I didn't really know how to respond in the moment. And that's what I said. I said, I haven't thought about that. I'll think about it and get back to you. But what I've been thinking a lot about is just how much heroism there was from those people in those moments of just utter terror. The stories coming out, the heroic stories coming out of how people saved people, but also how people died protecting their children. And I would urge people to go look up a lot of those stories. Yael Bartour has been sharing a lot of them. Just unbelievable acts of heroism. This really, Jeremy mentioned not comparing this to the Nazis, but I think also, I've been talking a lot about the Holocaust because I have a very close friend who's a Holocaust survivor, and we've been sort of reading the news together, and what it's brought up for her. She's told me stories that she buried for 78 years that have been brought up by this. But in a way, of course, it's not the Holocaust, because there's a state and there's an army, and there's going to be a response, and there's going to be a proportionate response by a moral army. So in that sense, I think thinking about that heroism, that's what I'm going to be bringing into Shabbat with me this week.
So for my final thoughts, I wanted to, and this again, the structure of the show this time has been very free flowing because these really are all different aspects of the same discussion. They weave together. But my final thought, I think, is related to this question and maybe disagreement over civilizational conflict. I think no one has been proved more right in recent decades than Samuel Huntington. I think there is such a thing as civilizational conflict, and that's not the same thing as saying that, like, for example, an American who's a Muslim cannot be a patriotic American, and on the other side of that civilizational conflict in a real way, in the same way that Arab Israelis serving in the IDF are not on the same side as the savages that did this in Hamas, right? So it's not to deny the individual capacity of human beings, but I do think that, and actually this reminds me very much, and it's a good final thought, I think, to close on, at least for my part, is there's this discussion with George W. Bush that's going around, Axios published, right, where he's talking about how he sees the state of the world. And I was really disappointed to see that he's still clinging to the same notion, this notion that I obviously deeply disagree with, about the idea, and I think I can't remember the exact phrasing during the Bush administration that was used, but that the yearning for freedom beats in every human heart, or something flowery to that effect. And the way he described it was exactly about this relationship, this very difficult to confront relationship that Ben and Batya were arguing about. How much does what Hamas, the goals of Hamas and what they do, how much does it represent the Palestinian people, right? We know that there's no perfect analogy in any country, even a liberal democracy, between what the government does and what the people do. But we still recognize that there's some kind of tie between them, that these are not wholly unrelated entities. And I think the thing that's very difficult to accept, very difficult for Westerners to accept, and less difficult for Israelis to accept, only because they are forced to confront this day after day, year after year, decade after decade, is that actually there is a civilizational conflict, that there are deep divisions between peoples as to what they value. And George W. Bush's comments on all of this showed me that he still doesn't understand this, that his administration cheered for and pushed for these elections in Gaza that brought Hamas to power because they believed that sort of all peoples are equally both culturally inclined towards and prepared for liberal democracy, and that brought Hamas to power. And then similarly in the U.S. context, the bending over backwards that the Bush administration did to say, "Oh, we're at war with terror," which is a tactic and not a people, not even a concrete ideology, not even a sect or an interpretation of a religion, nothing concrete, but a tactic that can be used by any number of peoples for any number of causes. So I guess we do have, and then this is, I think, important because it's the key disagreement in many ways, not only in Israel, where one side of that agreement, I think, will now triumph due to the circumstances and the immediate danger, but a very important question for the West at large, whether we will believe that we are actually different and better than what the natural condition of human society, tribalism, sort of other civilizations. That doesn't mean that two human lives are not of equal worth, but it does mean that we have to have the self-confidence in ourselves and the constant self-flagellation and distraction in the West against this fundamental fact, I think can no longer survive to a certain extent in Israel. And it's why the left in Israel looks quite different than our left here at home, because of the contact with reality. But these remarks from George W. Bush really reminded me that there's a huge part of not only sort of migrants in the U.S. who believe this because they've always believed it, but of our own homegrown elite that believe that it's the same kind of reasoning that leads them to believe that there's a moral equivalency between the crimes of Hitler and Stalin in World War II, respectively, and the fact that the Allies firebombed Dresden. And that's the exact same mentality that criticizes Israel for the necessary actions that it must take in Gaza as a result of these actions, and doesn't recognize the moral clarity of why they're taking those actions and what they're responding to, and the difference in mentality and civilization between the two sides. Jeremy, I don't know if you have a final thought before we wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with you both with respect to Huntington and Bush broadly. I mean, I think we might differ in some contours, but I think the universalizing nature of American thought and ideology for many, many years has been very, very unhelpful. In that sense, I'm sort of a Kissingerian realist about a lot of things in diplomacy. I would also agree the very a lot of people said there was sort of a mask off moment that we saw at places like Harvard, where you had these groups all supporting Hamas effectively, and people said, "Oh my God, what's happening to elites?" I share that concern, but my frustration as fundamentally an American nationalist who does not view my primary interest as in this area is that it took a war in another country to make that happen. Whereas, in my view, American elites have been making clear their hatred for the American people and our traditional values, culture, and way of life for decades now. And so I resent that it has to be something in some other country that will wake up a lot of people to that reality. And so I think that's unfortunate. And then I think I'd probably finally close again with a little bit of hard-headed realism, which is the moral dimensions of this conflict being fully acknowledged. And I think I'm not in entire agreement with some of my other panelists, but I think I'm largely in agreement with them. That's not my primary thing. There's immoral, terrible things that happen all over the world. Armenians were ethnically cleansed in Nagorno-Karabakh like a couple weeks ago, and nobody even cared. It wasn't even a one-day story. This was also a very long-seated thing. So I think the real question is not whether Hamas did something horrible in Israel, which they did, and the Israelis will handle that in whatever way they think serves their national interests. But for us to keep in mind, our very real interests in the conflict in the world, our domestic problems at home, and to keep that very hard-headed realist kind of approach in mind in whatever we decide to do or not do in this region.
Yeah, just to wrap up this segment, Ben Weingarten had to drop off to do another media hit, but he is asking for our listeners to refer to his Twitter, where he has put his final thoughts there. Just to put a final point on this, there is this very strange, and the mask off moment you referred to, Jeremy. There is this very strange confluence that I don't think we can ignore between, and sort of allyship between the domestic, what we would call here on NatCon Squad, our domestic opponents verging on enemies who simply hate traditional America and traditional Americans, and this sort of largely imported, right, sentiments that are much, in some ways, much deeper, much more directly ethnic from some of these, like, for example, Palestinian studies professors or whatever. But they actually go together very well in this, even though logically you would think that people who support LGBTQ, right, and transing the kids, not a natural allies of Hamas, but in fact they seem to swim in the same coalition very well. And in fact, it's very interesting to watch people clothe these like very deep and very like lizard brain ethnic hatreds and tribal hatreds in the language of social justice, of decolonization, of playing all of the sort of harp strings of the American left as it exists today, and of the American elites as they exist today. So I don't think these are wholly separate enemies. But on behalf of Jeremy, Ben, and Batya, thanks for tuning in. I'm Inez Stepman. We'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.